Long ago, all roads led to Rome. But in the 20th century, all highways and skyways lead to Washington, D.C. In the beginning, it was just another part of the great American dream. A vision of a proud and shining city.
How does one make sense of the United States, the wealthiest country in history?
From its coffers have flowed the golden treasures of the New World.
Born out of what is considered to be the first liberal democratic revolution of the modern world to establish a constitutional republic completely freed from feudal vestiges. A country that grants its population some of the most tolerant civil liberties and the most widespread access to firearms in the world.
Along whose fabulous way rise the massive and majestic edifices of federal government.
Given these conditions, one might assume that the United States allows for the greatest prospects for radical democratic change.
We workers have nothing in common with the employers. We're in a class struggle.
If any first world country had the ideal preconditions for revolution, you would think it would be this one. Even Karl Marx, who by the way was a great admirer of the American Revolution, was convinced that amidst the abolition of slavery, the United States was up there with England and Germany for having the greatest prospects for socialist change. Many on the left, including much of the Marxist movement, believe that as full universal suffrage was achieved, and more political and economic rights were won over, the working class would have a greater ability to participate in the political system, and develop their own parties and institutions which would become large enough to eventually take over the government, democratically or by revolution if necessary. At the very least, you would think that trade unions would have a way greater power, given the greater ability for the working class to mobilize themselves.
The House of Representatives makes the laws by which we live. The United States Senate, guardian of the people, and those precious inalienable rights which are their heritage.
Yet this land of the free, this empire of liberty, has not seen any radical political changes whatsoever to disrupt the relations of class domination. The rare few cases in America of radical political changes demanded from below succeeding in any capacity, such as the New Deal, the Civil Rights Act, Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, have been implemented from the top down, under the discretion of ruling elite factions, as compromises in response to radical movements and often violent protests outside of the system. In other words, even in the rare few cases where social change has occurred, it was allowed only as a means to contain that very same social change within the limits of the established system. And these compromises occurred without the corporate duopoly having to concede political power. They didn't need to cede power to a workers' party, like many European parliamentary democracies had to.
Strikers will finally realize that labor cannot get very far if it makes itself unpopular with the bulk of the population in this country.
Without a single socialist, communist, or even social democratic workers' party coming close to sharing power at the federal level. And even despite the popularity of libertarianism, libertarian parties have no chance in America. Even Ross Perot, who was a libertarian billionaire running as a third-party candidate, had little to no chance whatsoever of displacing the Democratic-Republican duopoly. And yet anti-corporate parties think that they somehow have a chance within this current system.
In the San Francisco strike, a lot of people completely lost their heads.
In the United States, the total absence of a powerful workers' party has enabled a remarkable one-sidedness of class struggle, a level of class domination higher than any other country with democratic legitimacy. Do categories such as liberal democracy or representative government fully capture the full essence of what U.S. citizens are up against?
Think of the State Department, and you think of the architecture of diplomacy. This highly important division of government has long played a vital role in the precarious profession of world politics.
In order to have any chance of seriously changing the system, let alone displacing it, it is crucial to understand the nature of that system. And the answers are actually far from obvious. In this video, I'm going to be introducing you to the theory of managed democracy and the specter of inverted totalitarianism, pioneered by Sheldon Wolin, who I believe to be one of the most underrated political theorists.
Avoid the comfortable idea that the mere form of government can of itself safeguard a nation against despotism.
Democracy can ebb away in communities whose citizens allow power to become concentrated in the hands of bosses. Communities which concentrate decision-making in a few hands rate low on a power scale and are moving towards despotism.
The original definition of democracy, demokratia, demos plus kratia, stood for rule of the people or power of the people, which most famously emerged with the direct democracy in ancient Athens, which of course was exclusive to males, whose free time to engage in that level of civic participation was enabled by the labor of slaves. Now, it's all too easy to say that the United States or any existing democratic state is not a true democracy, in the sense that people don't actually rule. This is all too evident, but it does not actually tell us very much at all about actually existing democracy. And most people believe that full direct democracy is not possible within large republics anyway. What we're interested in is theorizing actually existing democracy, and the differences between them. Now, aside from royalists, Tories, or fascists on the right who critique democracy for their reasons, the most famous school of thought known to be critical of modern democracy is Marxism, which itself emerged out of the democratic republican tradition. The main Marxist objection to actually existing democracy is that democracy and capitalism are incompatible. Marxists believe that any democratic systems with a capitalist economy will always end up being a bourgeois democracy for the few, for a propertied minority, and this is because of the class relations of domination inscribed into the capitalist mode of production. The inherent inequality between the dominant property-owning classes and the propertyless dominated classes inevitably leads to those with the most money and power being able to manipulate the political process to their liking. Not only that, but with most of the population being stuck into wage labor, most people simply do not have the time or energy to participate in the political system, and tend to have low levels of civic engagement. While the Marxist critique of liberal democracy, or bourgeois democracy, is mostly true, the Marxist characterization of bourgeois democracy does not actually tell us very much about the differences between the systems of different capitalist democracies. Merely describing the United States, or any liberal democracy for that matter, as a bourgeois democracy tells us nothing about how many or how few democratic possibilities there are within that system for radical democratic change. Identifying the differences between different capitalist democracies and the possibilities that they allow for can be quite significant when considering viable paths for emancipatory politics, which will likely be different depending on the country. Viewing actually existing democracy on a spectrum would add a lot more nuance to the long-standing socialist debates surrounding reform or revolution. Revolutionary and reformist socialists have argued over the possibility of the electoral road to socialism, often without regard to the particularities of different liberal democracies in question. Lumping together all capitalist states with nominally liberal democratic systems under the category of bourgeois democracy ignores that some of these democracies get away with significantly more anti-democratic tendencies than others do, and some of them may allow for a lot more or a lot less possibilities for radical democratic change within them. It may be misleading to group the United States under the same category as other liberal democratic states in Europe, like France and Italy, which have allowed for a far greater diversity of political parties, who, despite often not fulfilling their promises, have nevertheless been able to share power democratically and even build centers of power in civil society. So the point is, while the Marxist critique of liberal democracy should be maintained, it is not enough. It is insufficient for fully understanding the complexities of liberal democratic systems. For a more robust theory of actually existing democracy, I believe we should turn to the work of Sheldon Wolin, and part of my own academic work has involved building on his theory of managed democracy and inverted totalitarianism. But what is managed democracy? What is inverted totalitarianism? What makes the American system different from other liberal democracies? What is generally meant by totalitarianism? According to the general conception of the term, the defining characteristic of totalitarian regimes is the attempt to achieve a totalizing realization of an ideological conception of society as a systemically ordered whole, where the parts, such as the state, politics, economy, cultural life, civil society, education, churches, family, are all coordinated to support and further the purposes of the regime. In reality, no totalitarian regime succeeded in perfectly realizing this vision, despite attempting to do so. Totalitarianism is considered to be a distinctly modern phenomenon, and it only makes sense as a distinct political category in relation to the ascendancy of modern constitutional democracy in the 19th to 20th century. More generally, liberal democracy is typically characterized by open pluralism, civil liberties, free and fair elections, party competition, power sharing, democratic accountability, and a constitutional representative government legitimized by popular sovereignty. Erasing the separations between the state and civil society, the public and the private, is generally considered to be a defining feature of 20th century totalitarian regimes. As we will see in the new inverted totalitarianism, a similar process takes place, but in reverse. Instead of total state control over civil society, corporate power emerges from the private sphere and spreads its tentacles into nearly all aspects of civil society in the state, subsuming both the public and the private. As a result, in the United States, the traditional distinctions between the two private spheres of public and private have become scrambled, and the social, the economic, and the political have all been blended together into a capitalist whole, a contradictory totality. As we will see in the next section, Wolin's description of the new inverted totalitarianism is a capitalist totalitarianism, and corporate power is at the heart of this contradictory totality being realized. What does Wolin mean by managed democracy? And why did he say that the United States specifically embody the specter of inverted totalitarianism? Although managed democracy and inverted totalitarianism are related components of Sheldon Wolin's theory, they do not actually refer to the same thing. According to Wolin, managed democracy is, quote, a political form in which governments are legitimated by elections that they have learned to control. Now, it's a lot more complex than that, because they don't actually control elections directly by rigging them. What he's concerned with is the containment of democracy, rather than the rigging of democracy. Wolin uses the term managed democracy to refer to systems with formally representative governments with nominally constitutional democratic practices, like elections, rights, etc., where opposition is neutralized instead of abolished, and politics is for the most part confined to the boundaries of the reigning political-economic ideology. Formal democratic procedures and rights exist to legitimize state power, but are contained within firm limits, without appearing to be overtly suppressed. Managed democracy involves the domestication of politics to make it safe for the groups that rule it. Inverted totalitarianism, on the other hand, can be regarded as a culmination of managed democracy. And what makes a regime on the cusp of inverted totalitarianism different from other managed democracies is that it is usually a superpower, which we will elaborate on in the next section. Wolin describes inverted totalitarianism as a specter because it exists as a strong set of anti-democratic tendencies advancing towards a managed totality that is not 100% realized. The expansion of capital, particularly in the form of corporate power, constitutes the totality that is being realized in inverted totalitarianism. The line between managed democracy and the specter of inverted totalitarianism can be regarded as a spectrum that is dependent on the degree to which this totality is achieved. And this totality is the corporate control over the demos, the corporatization of democracy. For Wolin, the demos, meaning the people in their civic capacity, doesn't just involve the process of electing officials and participating in the state's democratic processes. It also has to do with the civic practices of ordinary citizens, like collective deliberation, the power to influence the terms of public policy, and active engagement in political discourse. The trajectory towards inverted totalitarianism is reflected by a managed democracy's ability to obstruct political alternatives to the established political parties and their policies. While classical totalitarianism involved the complete rejection of democracy through a radical break from a previous fragile order, inverted totalitarianism represents the gradual inversion of a stable system with a formally democratic foundation into a superpower that is increasingly deprived of any meaningful democratic substance, that deprives the citizens of the practical means of representing their interests within that system. The sharing of political power and the ability of citizens to represent all of their different interests within the political system are considered to be some of the essential values of modern democracy. It is an inverted form of totalitarianism because it is one that professes to be the exact opposite of what it in fact is. In many ways, this inverted form of totalitarianism is more Orwellian than the actual totalitarianism that Orwell was writing about, in the sense that it uses doublespeak and newspeak to disclaim its real identity. Inverted totalitarianism undermines democracy in inverted ways. It depoliticizes democracy rather than directly attacking it, and it relies on the demobilization of its people rather than trying to mobilize an ideal homogeneous subject. As Sheldon Wolin himself states, quote,
"In coining the term inverted totalitarianism, I tried to find a name for a new type of political system, seemingly one driven by abstract totalizing powers, not by personal rule. One that succeeds by encouraging political disengagement rather than mass mobilization, that relies more on private media than on public agencies to disseminate propaganda reinforcing the official version of events."
Inverted totalitarianism is only partly a state-centered phenomenon. Its long-term hegemony is much more stable and adaptable because it is not dependent on the cult of any central charismatic figurehead. Without a clear locus of power, the system is much harder to resist. Far from being the architects of the system, leaders and politicians in inverted totalitarianism are themselves products of the system.
Hello, everybody. That's a nice, beautiful-looking group of people. So I know this menu better than you do.
When managed democracy imposes so many obstacles that negate practically all serious political alternatives to the system's hegemonic logic, the system becomes functionally more akin to a totalitarian society. Totalitarian in the sense that it strives towards totalizing ends. As Wolin notes, the American regime's hegemonic logic of inverted totalitarianism is that of capitalism, and it is, quote, virtually as undisputed as Nazi doctrine was in 1930s Germany. As reflected in the title of Sheldon Wolin's book, Democracy Incorporated, the union of corporate and state power is a key characteristic of inverted totalitarianism. Unlike fascism, where capital was subordinate to the politics of the state, in inverted totalitarianism the roles are reversed. Capital dominates politics. Influenced by Marx, though not a Marxist, Wolin saw capitalism as a system of power with totalizing tendencies that are a driving force of managed democracy and inverted totalitarianism. The shift from managed democracy to inverted totalitarianism marks a political turning point, where corporate power evolves into a globalizing co-partnership with the state that intensifies both state and corporate power. It strives for the domestication of domestic politics while using the military power of superpower to project corporate interests globally. Wolin uses the concept of inverted totalitarianism as an ideal type, to demarcate the extreme endpoint of managed democracy, when the state and civil society are totally corporatized. In various managed democracies, most of all in the United States, capitalism has subsumed control over the general population through the privatization of most public functions, like health, communication, transportation, education, and even prisons and the defense industry. The liberation of capital leads more and more to its total control over civil society. The result of this liberal totalitarianism is a more extensive, more invasive system than ever before, that contains democracy more efficiently, as it liberates centers of power and relations of domination from democratic accountability. If the state-owned media organization does not platform certain candidates, people know to protest the government, and in a multi-party democracy can vote out the present government and elect a new one, who will change the rules. But when a private media corporation decides not to platform certain candidates, there is pretty much nothing we can do, or rather nothing that the capitalist-managed democracies would be willing to do. The corporation is accountable only to its shareholders and its board of directors. Now, what again makes the US regime unique? What makes it particularly more closer to inverted totalitarianism than other managed democracies are? For Sheldon Wolin, what makes the United States uniquely close to inverted totalitarianism is not merely the triumph of capitalism and the absence of socialist opposition. Recognizing that there is already a contradiction between capitalism and democracy, Wolin's category of inverted totalitarianism is not meant to apply to every single capitalist democracy, all of which are managed democracies to an extent. There are a few main reasons why Wolin focuses so much on the United States, and considers it to be unique compared to most capitalist democracies. First and foremost is the United States' status as the world's leading superpower, which allowed it to overcome democratic restrictions on power in the name of national security in its efforts to project the totalizing expansion of corporate power around the world. Secondly, unlike the classical totalitarianism which emerged in countries with democratic traditions that were quite weak, short-lived, or non-existent, America's totalitarian trajectory evolved out of what was once a strong managed democracy. Strong as in strong legitimacy and being able to maintain itself over a long period of history. In contrast to classical fascism, which usually comes out of a failed democracy or out of a system with no democracy whatsoever, inverted totalitarianism comes out of a strong managed democracy, with a constitutional system that was able to maintain itself through a long period of history. In this regard, it is only fair to compare the United States with states with strong democratic legitimacy that are wealthy and industrialized, unlike the largely disregarded phantom democracies of the Third World like Russia. America possesses unique institutional features that allow it to achieve a near-total negation of political alternatives and possibilities for those alternatives to emerge, such as the uniquely rigid institutional obstacles to reforming the system, along with the totalizing powers that come with being the world's leading superpower. Lastly, the United States represents the liberal democratic country where capitalism has by far the most totalizing reach into all spheres of civil society, including even its opposition, making it more corporatized and contained than any other advanced industrial liberal democratic state. Wolin states that, quote,
"One cannot point to any national institution that can accurately be described as democratic, surely not in the highly managed, money-saturated elections, the lobby-infested Congress, the imperial presidency, the class-biased judicial and penal system, or least of all, the media."
Luckily, navigating the media landscape has become a lot easier with apps like Ground News, the sponsor of today's video. Their app and website provides very comprehensive overviews of the latest news, allowing you to easily compare how stories are covered across the political spectrum. For every article reporting on a story, you will see the source's political bias, how factual they are, and who owns them. Ground News also has this useful blind spot feature to identify which news stories are underreported by some sides of the political spectrum, and to check what your own political biases might be. For example, let's take this case of protesters in support of Palestine demonstrating near the homes of these high-ranking US government officials. As you can see, most of the news outlets who have put out articles covering the story have been either from the right-wing or center perspective, and the factuality of reporting has been quite mixed. You can also see which articles came from independent news sources, and how many came from media conglomerates or outlets with wealthy private owners. You can sign up using my link in the description to get 40% off of their Vantage plan, which gives you unlimited access for only $5 a month. Now back to the video. Now that we've outlined the general characteristics of inverted totalitarianism and managed democracy, it is important to chronologically unpack the history of managed democracy and its trajectory towards inverted totalitarianism, the antecedents and the historical precedents that led up to it, particularly in the United States.
At this time, there are some 10 million workplaces in the United States, where we're free to make 10 million plans.
All democratic states become managed to a certain extent as soon as democracy is constitutionalized into a form with institutionalized norms and codes that limit how much democracy is allowed and what is politically possible for citizens within it. For Wolin, the containment of democracy starts with constitutions. Constitutions set limits to the potentials of democracy and contain the amount of politics deemed acceptable within it, and they are usually intended to make the system better suited for the dominant power groups of society. As Wolin himself puts it, quote,
"When democracy is settled into a stable form, such as prescribed by a written constitution, it is also settled down and rendered predictable. Then it becomes the stuff of manipulation, of periodic elections that are managed and controlled, a public opinion that is shaped, cajoled, misled, and then pulled, and of a legal system that dictates how much democracy is to be permitted."
Thus, to a certain extent, all actually existing democracies, insofar as they are states with constitutions, are effectively managed democracies. We can consider managed democracy on a spectrum based on how much democracy is contained. On the other hand, the specter of inverted totalitarianism is the culmination of a managed democracy turning democracy upside down. Wolin argues that the Founding Fathers of America were in fact the first founders of managed democracy, at least in the modern era. The framers of the US Constitution took it even further when it came to managing democracy. The US Constitution is the oldest constitution still in effect, and is the most difficult one to amend. What was already a highly restricted constitutional system, with rights and privileges won over by various political struggles and violent protests, really started to morph into the more sophisticated version of managed democracy seen today through the advent of what Wolin calls rationalization and the technologization of politics, that emerged in the 20th century after universal suffrage had been largely established in most democratic states. The rationalization/technologization of politics was marked by the attempt to create a science of politics and achieve mastery over public opinion, democratic governance, and the electoral process by making them more intelligible, manipulatable, and predictable. This included the advent of political technologies such as quantitative public opinion research, expert tacticians, rhetorical strategists, speechwriters, think tanks, and focus groups to gauge what strategies would work best on voters. Such practices, which constitute the fields often called political management or just PR, a euphemism for propaganda and brainwashing, were supplemented by the incorporation of certain forms of psychology originally popularized in the business world, like rational choice theory, behavioral psychology, and even Freudian psychology, all geared towards priming the voter's subconscious mind.
That's what the money is for!
The language of politics became the language of advertising, as the techniques of advertising became increasingly normalized within politics. The technologization of politics and the ideology of political management also dismantled the demos by dismantling the citizen. The citizenry has been increasingly disaggregated into segmented electorates and targeted voter demographics that can be more easily manipulated, managed, anticipated, and sometimes even pitted against each other. While such tactics are often associated with racism, one can find its progressive manifestation in modern-day identity politics.
Instead of listening to that little voice, you need to find yours and make it heard.
The fact that the democratic process, the public, and the business enterprise all became increasingly subject to rational management right around the time that the world had become increasingly democratized in the 20th century through universal suffrage, civil liberties, and various economic rights won over by the labor movement is not a coincidence. The dominant classes in the capitalist state had to develop more sophisticated methods of administering and managing the growing population of alienated laborers, who had won the political rights to organize and engage in politics to a greater extent. In all democracies with a class society, the mass and its sheer numbers were always a political menace to the privileged minority, and it used to be more common to find theorists and politicians who would openly denounce democracy. But since the widespread adoption of universal suffrage, societies have undergone a rhetorical revolution, in which every single politician who wants to have some level of success has to at least pay lip service to democracy.
Democracy is really at stake.
Even if they loathe it.
This election isn't won. I'm not sure that you'll ever have another election.
But thanks to the overpowering psychopolitical technologies of manipulation normalized in the new Pavlovian democracy, the mass has been transformed into more of a domesticated plebiscite rather than a looming menace. Now that the powerful have been able to keep it tamed, democracy has practically become a universal value that nearly all powerful people in every society are comfortable with championing, even those who revere it most. However, none of this is unique to America alone. What truly allowed American-managed democracy to evolve into a more inverted totalitarian regime was its development into a superpower, the most exceptional feature that makes the United States a wildly different beast compared to other breeds of managed democracies.
One question that forms the underlying theme of the new chapters is this: was it possible for liberal democracy to wage a total war and remain semi-mobilized for almost a half-century, confronting what were widely perceived as the most highly concentrated systems of power in human history without itself undergoing profound changes, or even a regime change?
It is worth noting that the policy of total war, first articulated by the proposals of German military figures such as Erich Ludendorff and his doctrine of the total war, and Ernst Junger's notion of total mobilization, were key drivers of totalitarianism in Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union, already paranoid by the encirclement of imperialist powers, adopted a similar total war approach to prepare for potential war with either the hostile Western empires or the new emerging Nazi threat. Although quite different from these regimes, America's war mobilizations and its transformation into a regime of superpower are when Uncle Sam started to show his most totalitarian traits. The USA's trajectory towards inverted totalitarianism goes hand in hand with the evolution of what Sheldon Wolin calls superpower. A central theme of Wolin's work in his examination of democracies throughout history, both in the modern period and in ancient Athens, is that imperialism is fundamentally at odds with democracy. It's quite simple. When a country is constantly mobilizing itself for war, its rulers can more easily cultivate what Wolin calls a power imaginary, a unifying mission against an external enemy, giving the state more excuses to declare states of exception, to curtail democratic obstacles and crack down on dissent. Aside from the United States, the most prominent historical examples are how Athenian democracy and the early, less democratic democracy of the Roman Republic were totally eviscerated by their own expansionism. Seen as early as the Louisiana Purchase, the United States didn't take very long to develop a persistent drive for expansion, which exponentially grew following the doctrine of manifest destiny, which eventually triumphed over the political factions who preferred isolationism.
An anti-imperialist league is formed. Among its distinguished members are Grover Cleveland.
While the US had been building up an empire in Latin America, which greatly accelerated under Woodrow Wilson in the name of spreading democracy, it had not yet developed overtly totalitarian tendencies at home until World War I, during the first Red Scare following the Russian Revolution. Around this time, the progressive president Woodrow Wilson suspended the freedom of speech to jail and deport socialist anti-war activists under the Sedition and Espionage Act, which overrided the Constitution to suppress dissent. The high watermark of socialism in America was arguably when Eugene Debs' Socialist Party got 6% of the vote in the presidential election of 1912, while Eugene Debs was in jail. Even just his modest popularity prior to the election was already enough to land him in prison for speaking up against the intervention into World War I. However, the ideology of anti-communism reached a new totalizing fanatical zeal during the Cold War with the USSR in the late 1940s to the early 1950s.
It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures.
By far the most decisive turning points in the evolution of inverted totalitarianism came with the major precedents set in the development of the American national security apparatus, in which a whole new dimension of authoritarian state powers became normalized. One of these precedents can be illustrated perfectly in what was at the time a top-secret report formulated by the National Security Council in 1950 under President Truman, known as NSC 68, which many scholars consider to be the Bible of American national security, and it embodied the new ideology of the Cold War. The totally apocalyptic language of this document invoked the notion of total mobilization against an insidious Soviet enemy bent on world domination, infiltrating the country through secret hidden operations in a new conflict that would determine the fate of civilization itself. Quote,
"While the fundamental purpose of the U.S. is to assure the integrity and vitality of our free society, which is founded upon the dignity and worth of the individual, the Soviet Union, unlike previous aspirants to hegemony, is animated by a new fanatic faith, antithetical to our own, and seeks to impose its absolute authority over the rest of the world. Conflict has, therefore, become endemic and is waged, on the part of the Soviet Union, by violent or nonviolent methods in accordance with the dictates of expediency. With the development of increasingly terrifying weapons of mass destruction, every individual faces the ever-present possibility of annihilation should the conflict enter the phase of total war."
This fanatical obsession with communism had major implications for domestic politics, paving the way for McCarthyism, the ideology surrounding the anti-communist purge initiated by Senator Joseph McCarthy. This culminated in the Second Red Scare, what could be described as a totalizing inquisition of all opposition that was remotely anti-capitalist, an ideological purge more far-reaching than in any democracy in the developed world, as the scope of the American crusade against communism encompassed not just those who supported the evil empire of godless communism, but also left-wing critics, dissidents, and subversives at home who became suspected as spies or traitors. What was known as the Open Society became devoid of almost any genuine pluralism after it eclipsed virtually all of its enemies. Sheldon Wolin paints a vivid picture of the totalitarian environment occurring around this time. Quote,
"Anti-communism turned into disloyalty and became a broad-brush category that included communists, alleged communist sympathizers, and those who refused to expose colleagues or acquaintances who were communists. Blacklists were drawn up by authorities to identify and root out suspected Reds and their sympathizers in the entertainment industries, in the media, and among intellectuals. Opposition required exceptional courage. For the first time in our nation's history, universities became the object of a widespread purge. Loyalty oaths were introduced as a precondition of employment in many state institutions of higher learning, while some intellectuals and academics were recruited as government agents to report on the political activities of colleagues. The Internal Security Act of 1950 established 6 concentration camps. Police and federal law enforcement authorities undertook the systematic surveillance of suspect political activity.
NSC 68 also called for a massive rearmament campaign and anti-Soviet measures. It was around this time where the national security state as we know it was established, when President Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947, which established the CIA and later the NSA. This allowed the US to become exponentially more undemocratic even by the standards of liberal democracy. Aside from the multitude of covert CIA operations in foreign countries involving the facilitation of military coups, assassinations, and the installment of dictatorships, the massive arsenal of unaccountable secretive powers delegated to the national security apparatus also had pretty totalitarian ramifications for politics at home. Most notably, the US government's premeditated counter-revolution against anti-war activists, the civil rights movement, and black power leaders included the FBI's now famous but previously secret COINTELPRO program, ironically launched by the same Democrat administration who signed the Civil Rights Act. COINTELPRO involved lawless operations akin to the East German Stasi, including warrantless surveillance, the infiltration of political parties, and arbitrary assassinations of leaders of the Black Panther Party and other black activists. The most famous example being publicly proven being Fred Hampton.
After a 15-minute gun battle that cost Illinois Black Panther Party Chairman Fred Hampton his life, Sergeant Gross described the parade as 15 minutes of hell and a miracle. A miracle because not one policeman was killed a miracle because not more policemen were shot.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
The language of total war was also invoked to crack down on dissidents in a less overtly political way. The highly politically motivated war on drugs started under Richard Nixon, which was later intensified by Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton, disproportionately targeted anti-war activists and most of all African Americans, causing the US to have the highest rate of mass incarceration of any country in the world. Despite the US having the worst prison conditions in the developed world and what are effectively private gulags, aka privatized prisons that exploit unpaid prison labor, mass incarceration is not widely considered to be a political phenomenon because it does not explicitly target political dissidents, even though that's effectively what it does. To distract people living within the belly of the beast, superpower always needs an external other to justify its unaccountable power. After the fall of the USSR, the US regime needed a new enemy, but this time a more amorphous one: Islamic terrorism. The George W. Bush administration's war on terror came with a massive concentration of unaccountable executive power. Perfect example being the permanent institutionalization of the Doomsday Project, making what was originally supposed to be a state of exception a permanent power within the national security apparatus. I did a segment all about this in the One Dime Radio podcast, where I interviewed Aaron Good in his book on the Deep State. Check that episode out if you want to learn more about this. If you want to see more of this algorithmically unpractical content, then you can become a patron. Without patrons, this channel would not exist.
Patriot Act, Patriot Act. I love it, I love it, I love it.
The Patriot Act of 2001 included new NSA surveillance programs, the arbitrary detainment of suspects without due process, more human rights violations in Guantanamo Bay, and various war operations deemed illegal by international law.
Light them all up.
While state authoritarianism and total mobilization were what inverted totalitarianism shared with its less friendly fascist cousin, demobilization was its unique weapon of social control. The triumph of neoliberal doctrine led to the disaggregation, or should I say deterritorialization, of the citizenry into a political body without commonality.
We the people tell the government what to do.
Neoliberalism has become somewhat of a buzzword on the left side of YouTube. Yet the neoliberal turn is crucial for understanding the trajectory from managed democracy to inverted totalitarianism. Neoliberalism emerged not just solely as a reaction against organized labor and the welfare state, but also as a counter-revolution aimed at the full domestication of democracy. As it clamped down on the remaining democratic possibilities for social protests that were enabled by more favorable material conditions, facilitated by the welfare state compromise during the post-war economy. And the thinkers that inspired neoliberalism were pretty explicit that this was their goal. The relation between organized labor and democracy, and the neoliberal suspicion towards it, can be observed in the writings of thinkers such as Friedrich von Hayek, in his famous book A Road to Serfdom. In his attack against the proposals of Keynesian social programs, Hayek warned that if the state compromised too much with unions and allowed the poor too many welfare programs, it might empower them to keep organizing for more demands, potentially leading to socialism. The neoliberal antithesis to social democracy in the late 70s to 80s would come in the form of austerity and privatization paired with an authoritarian state to crush organized labor and social movements. The stagflation crisis of the 70s allowed neoliberal ideas, which were gradually promoted by powerful corporate-backed think tanks and lobbyists, to become accepted by the dominant parties and later replaced the Keynesian consensus for managing economic conditions. This also represented a new class war, culminating in the Reagan administration's attack on unions, cutbacks of social programs, and massive increases in interest rates, which were presented to be against inflation, but were really for raising unemployment in order to curb the bargaining power of organized labor, which had increased significantly during the tight labor markets amidst the Vietnam War, allowing labor a lot more power in their disputes with capital than they did before. And neoliberalism was the answer for the dominant classes. Neoliberal policy was also in part an intensification of the earlier paranoid conservative reaction that occurred under Nixon against the democratic movements of the 60s, like Black Power, anti-war activism, and the campus protests that demanded the democratization of universities. Wolin contends that despite their shortcomings, these movements represented the first expressions in America since the Red Scare of a new embryonic politics that unapologetically championed the taboo collectivist values of equality and solidarity. While these movements did not translate into a political majority, the mere fact that they were able to arise and slightly disrupt the political quietism that characterized the 1950s caused authorities to be a lot more uncertain about their power, their confidence and obedience. So neoliberalism was also an attempt to cripple the capacity for mobilization by ushering in a more cutthroat economy, characterized by job precarity that made active civic engagement a lot more difficult, making society more productive but more deprived of time and energy. The precarious, fast-paced life, intensified by austerity, kept people in a constant state of powerlessness, fear of losing their job, pressuring them to adapt to the latest trends in the labor market. That would eventually culminate in what we now call the gig economy. Neoliberal ideology provided a belief system that rationalized these conditions by individualizing social problems. Instead of explicitly condemning democracy, the rhetoric of neoliberal politicians liberalized it by equating democracy with private freedom instead of common interests, and further entrenched the privatization of the citizenry by reducing civic virtue to consumer rationality. The new spirit of capitalism in technologically advanced societies provides equivalents for democracy's values: mass consumption in place of participation, vote with your dollar, consumer sovereignty in place of mass empowerment, inclusive pro-diversity consumption in place of exclusion. On the one hand, Wolin saw a virtual disappearance of dissident voices in the US media, especially after 9/11.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
And this preclusion of critical dissident voices was not dependent on excessive state censorship, as the uniformity imposed on journalists and pundits by private media conglomerates performs this job far more efficiently. On the other hand, Wolin also observed an almost opposite contrasting tendency that took shape in the 21st century, which would culminate in what we today call identity politics, a new pseudo-politics of difference, starting as early as the 90s, but especially in the 2000s. But this new pseudo-identity politics was embraced by much of the existing left, if you want to call it that. Wolin believed that despite appearing to be progressive in many ways, this type of politics had a splintering anti-democratic effect. Managed democracy in the 21st century splinters the citizenry into disaggregated identity categories that can be easily targeted, just like target market demographics, deterring people from coalescing into formidable political forces based on common goals.
Equal pay for equal work, everywhere.
While this would come to be associated with the liberal faction of capitalism, the Democratic Party, identity politics was already embraced even by George W. Bush. Bush's government was praised for having the most diverse cabinet in history, with names like Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice being part of his government, in Intersectional Imperialism. But of course, the diversity of Bush's cabinet was not as diverse as the array of bombs being dropped on Iraq.
I'm U.S. Army Corporal Emma Malone Lord, and I answered my calling.
Not to mention that George W. Bush's first election was extremely contestable, many believing it to be a stolen election, with the vote count in the state of Florida being believed to be rigged by his brother Jeb Bush, who was governor of Florida at the time. All of this culminated in a giant death blow to the demos that consolidated the development of inverted totalitarianism. This video can only give you a skeleton key to the overall framework of managed democracy. If you want to learn further as to what it is, I recommend checking out the podcast on One Dime Radio and on Patreon. There's a lot of work to do to elaborate on this theory and build on it. While we have primarily focused on the United States, it would also be worth comparing other liberal democracies that may exhibit similar tendencies. But overall, I think Wolin's work presents us with a more realist framework for understanding actually existing democracy, rather than on liberal democracy's own idealistic terms. One that can situate different countries with liberal democratic systems on a spectrum, rather than just using the category of bourgeois democracy to slap onto all systems, which doesn't really tell us much about what is actually possible within these systems. Overall, the insights presented here pose significant implications for democratic action. When anti-democratic tendencies become so prevalent as to nullify any realistic possibilities for radical change, let alone the possibility of implementing such a change within the existing system, it may be more illuminating for opposition movements to realize that what they are up against is more akin to an inverted totalitarian regime rather than just a flawed liberal democracy. This is a fan-funded channel, and the work that I do would simply not be possible without my community of patrons. By becoming a patron, you get access to our Discord server, you can chat with other One Dime viewers, and you get access to a whole array of exclusive content. You get an extra podcast for every One Dime Radio podcast that comes out. Leave a like and a comment, share the video around, helps a lot.